Welcome, everyone, to the Pick Six podcast, where we discuss the biggest and best stories in college football. I'm your host, Chris Cheng, and joining me, as always, is my co host, Rudy Tamarchio. Rudy, it didn't take long, but another portal problem has presented itself, and wouldn't you have it? Miami is being accused of tampering. You know, there's an old saying in college football, if you're not tampering, you're not trying. So let's fill everyone in who maybe not be familiar with this whole Xavier Lucas situation. Let's fill people in.
All right, let's go back to this is a few weeks old already. This is starting when this is like shortly after the Pop Tarts Bowl, I'm
Hmm.
pretty sure. I think it was still in 2024. So when they said we're going to make that a 2025 problem, that's exactly what happened here. They said we're going to make this a 2025 problem. Uh but Xavier Lucas is a prospect from South Florida originally. He went to American Heritage. He is a South Florida kid through and through. He enrolled to play at Wisconsin last year for his freshman year of college football. Miami was actually number 2 on his list of
Yep.
signing day prospects. Uh, Essentially, his father is having a health condition right now. He's having
Yeah.
some sort of grave illness. It's an awful thing. So Xavier Lucas said, "Hey, Wisconsin, I want to enter the transfer portal. I want to go back to Miami to go be with my dad and play closer to home because he's sick. I don't know how much time he has left. I don't know. None of us know that the illness hasn't been disclosed. None of us know. But if it's bad
It's none
enough
of
to
our business
say,
either way, by the way. That's the
frankly,
first and foremost thing. It's like it's none of our business what's going on with the
right, like
family. If they say
HIPAA
there's a
aside."
yeah,
Yeah, HIPAA aside, it's a personal reason. That's all that matters. When you're at work, you're not gonna your boss doesn't say, "Well, oh, is that stage one, stage two, stage three?" Like you don't go into those kind of specifics. Either way, if your motivation to come back home to South Florida is primarily driven by your father's health and hopefully being able to spend more time with them if you have limited time, uh that's as good a reason as anything. So he wanted to
absolutely.
put his name in the transfer portal, and Wisconsin said, "Not so fast, my friend." And if you go back to like NCAA bylaws that were written for the transfer portal, so this is still fairly new. It's under 10 years old. Um, a school must, regardless of condition, must enter the player in the transfer portal within 2 business days of them indicating their interest in entering the portal.
Right.
No questions asked. Wisconsin didn't do that. And, it's a good thing that Xavier Lucas got representation when he did,
Hmm.
because everything was very quiet. And the only thing you
Yeah.
had was rumors of Wisconsin saying, "Oh, well, Miami tampered with you, so we can't allow that to happen." And then it came into, "Oh, well, you actually already have, you've already been receiving NIL money from here, so you can't leave now that you're signed into that." And, through legal representation, we learned that this is all, frankly, false.
Yeah.
It's all false, according to, I mean, look, unless a lawsuit is actually filed, none of this will ever be proven true or false, because discovery is the only way you're going to learn about that, when both sides have access to
Yep.
the evidence that they want to bring to the equation. So there is no lawsuit. How much further do you want me to go with this? You want me to go like full story as to where we got to the present day?
Yeah, I mean, it's fine. I want to make sure when we get into the nitty gritty of this, people have like just a general understanding of basically what's happening. Because one thing I do want to add is all of this began on December 19th. That is when Xavier Lucas requested to be put in the transfer portal. He filled his paperwork out. By NCAA bylaws, it's mandated that the universities must enter those players within 2 business days. Okay, so now we're in what, January 24th? Still hasn't happened, but go ahead.
I almost want to pull a J-Ro and go 2 business days, or like Mike B of the Miami Heat, dos dias.
Minuto, 2
Dos días de
días.
negocio. Exactly. That's what you need to know on that end. So it's a good thing that he retained legal counsel when he did Xavier Lucas. He retained
Right.
a lawyer named Darren Heitner, who, by the way, has negotiated a number of NIL and other contractual deals for both professional athletes and collegiate athletes. So this isn't like a one-off basis. He's
Right.
also not a University of Miami affiliated lawyer. He's a graduate of the University of Florida.
Mhm.
He doesn't have any ties to the University of Miami.
No, I think he is an
Um,
adjunct professor, I think.
he might lecture a little bit, but like in
Yeah.
terms of like
I just wanna make sure
dedication
we're
to a
giving the
school,
facts, you know?
he's not a fan. Let's just put
Ri
it that way. It's
No,
not like
exactly.
he's right. He's not a super fan by any means. Not like he's a season ticket holds all the
Right.
games and throws up the U.
He's not
So
us.
right. I mean, we like him,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
he's not us.
sure.
Um, anyway, they have to get creative here because no matter what amount of, I guess, like posturing that Heitner was doing, Wisconsin wasn't budging.
Right.
And every couple days, it seemed like it was a new story of, oh, it was an NIL deal. Oh, actually, it wasn't NIL. It was another contract. And through Darren Heitner's representation, we learned that the Big Ten, as a conference, decided that they were going to force all of their student athletes to sign an agreement
Yep.
that would essentially revenue share is coming to college football. It's something that the NCAA and also all of the member institutions have known about for a long time, but
Mhm.
it's not actually effective yet. This is something that I think the earliest is like April 17th or something like that.
Correct.
That that a federal judge can enact this revenue sharing piece.
Right.
The Big Ten decided to draft like a template paperwork agreement, as Darren Heitner was calling it, an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, um, that all players had to sign, basically saying that in order to receive this revenue sharing agreement that's coming from the NCAA, you must sign away your rights to any NIL name, image, and likeness for the period of 2 years to the member institution you're playing for.
Right.
Uh, we just heard about this because of this case. Before, if we didn't have this happen, we would have no idea this paperwork actually exists. It's from just hearing about what this memorandum is. Wisconsin's trying to enforce it like it's an actual contract.
Well,
You
I
can't
think
hold. Yeah, go ahead.
right. What I think Wisconsin's doing is because in 2025, it'll be the first year that schools can sign revenue sharing contracts with players and directly pay them for their services. And the reason why it'll be this year is because what like you were insinuating is by the 17th of this year, which will be before the 2025 season, there is expected to be a final decision made on this settlement. So I think what the Big Ten and what the University of Wisconsin were basically trying to do is they were trying to get ahead of the curve for the 2025 season. So they were drafting these contracts for their member institutions, the Big Ten, and then disseminating them. And then the universities were going out and saying, hey, when this takes effect in about 2 or 3 months, when because they're expecting, which we still don't even know. I mean, April may come and the judge may not even rule, and they may say, hey, you guys need to go back and restructure this. This still isn't good. And that could push revenue sharing to 2026. But I think they're anticipating that this settlement will be settled on the 17th of April, which means it'll go into effect for this next season. Okay, well, for those of you who may not be aware, there's a thing called spring ball or spring football. And that's when a lot of these teams kind of figure out who they're going to have for the fall season, mainly also because we now have a transfer portal as well in the spring. So students will be players and student athletes, whatever you want to call them, will be coming in and out in the spring, and they want to make sure they got all their ducks in a row going into the fall. So that is why you're probably wondering, well, how are they disseminating these contracts before a settlement is done? They're almost like a preemptive measure at this point to make sure, which they may have actually jumped the gun, which actually may put them in a worse position, the Big Ten and a UW. Go ahead, Rudy.
Yeah, a worse position because well, first of all, the idea that you're trying to hold somebody, let alone a 19-year-old kid, 18 or 19-year-old kid, you're trying to hold him to an agreement that doesn't even come into effect and has no guarantee of going into effect.
Right.
So you're trying to like threaten this kid who just wants to go back, regardless of where he wants to play football. He just wants to be closer to his family again. Like I think
And
that's
and
where, yeah,
And here's the other thing too. So there's because we just went down a little bit of a rabbit hole with the revenue sharing, but there is also an NIL component to it as well.
yes,
So with the revenue sharing, they're two completely independent things. So the revenue sharing comes down and basically it reared its head around because for up until 2 years ago or a year ago, football players, college athletes were not allowed to get paid in any shape, way, or form. It was $0. A lot of
you couldn't
yeah,
you couldn't pay a meal, you couldn't give them a gift, nothing.
exactly.
Even as a
Which is
fellow
why we were
student.
on probation several times, the University of Miami. There's a little guy named Evan Shapiro. You should go look at him. But anyways, with this component now, with these universities want to getting ahead of the curve, they're now trying to implement and trying to build in a budget for this revenue sharing, which can range anywhere from some are saying 13 to 20 million for each athletic department, right? And what that basically is every school would have to pay by mandate their student athletes, right? That's one portion of it. Then you have the collectives, which are part of name, image, and likeness, which are a completely different thing. These would be your traditional boosters who are paying for money. These are basically kind of endorsement deals, but they're not called endorsement deals because then they would have to technically be considered an employee and be under contract, which again still hasn't been ironed out with this whole house settlement thing. So you've got the universities wanting to pay because the universities and these conferences are getting paid billions of dollars from the media to sell the rights to their games, which never went to the players, but now a portion of that now needs to go to the players. And then you have the players themselves earning their own money through a independent collective from the universities to be used for any sort of marketing or advertising, right? That uses their name, image, or likeness. What's
Loose
important,
affiliations.
yeah.
Like the collective isn't actually an arm of the university,
No,
but
they're
they do
completely
grow.
independent, which is why I'm trying to differentiate these two things because Wisconsin is saying that he not only Xavier Lucas not only entered with the university but also with their collective. Here's the
Yep.
most important portion of all of this because what some of you may be watching is going, okay, this isn't a big deal. Kid broke a contract, just give the money back. There's been no money exchanged. There's been $0 exchanged in any of this, which to me is one of the most important factors. When I was looking into this story, when I first heard the story, I was like, well, I mean, I kind of get, the university's, perspective and their side of it because, yeah, I mean, if you're giving a kid, 800,000, 500,000, whatever the denomination is of money, he should give that back because he's no longer playing. Well, come to find out, lo and behold, Xavier Lucas hasn't gotten a dime. He's gotten zero. So, in my opinion, just that on the surface should just be like, we're done. But the story doesn't stop there. Go ahead, Rudy. Continue on.
That's right. So as you reach this, as Lucas and Heitner reach this impasse where they realize Wisconsin's not going to put him in the portal,
Right.
the time is ticking. How does he get out of Wisconsin? How does
Right.
he get out scot free? How does he keep his eligibility? Well, Darren Heitner decides to go do a little digging through the NCAA bylaws, like all good lawyers do.
Hmm.
What does he find? Lo and behold, we would call it what's old is new again. But back in the day, before the transfer portal, you could transfer, you could be released. And one way that was always tried and true was just by simply de-enrolling from a university. That means withdrawing from all of your classes and not having any course credits on your schedule. So essentially zero course hours scheduled for your next academic year. That automatically withdraws you from the school.
Yep.
And then applying like any other student does into the transfer window for the University of Miami. So he was able to do that by the skin of his teeth because if you're looking at the number of days between, early December and this new spring semester coming out, that's not much time left.
Right.
So he's able to do that and enroll at Miami effectively for the fall. So that's kind of how that went around. He didn't go through for the spring window.
No,
He
I
was
think he did.
applying toward well, that's what happened afterwards. That's like
Right.
that's the ex post facto way of saying like once you got accepted for the fall, now you're being
Right.
retroactively added to
Yeah.
the spring
Exactly.
semester.
Right.
So he steps on campus at Coral Gables as a student of the University of Miami, not even affiliated with the football
A
program or
program.
athletics at all.
Exactly. So with Lucas unenrolling and then formally enrolling as a UM student and finding this loophole in the system, does this blow up and do away with the transfer portal? What implications do you think this has for the transfer portal moving forward?
I don't think this really affects the portal because the system would have worked if Wisconsin just followed the system. This wasn't a kid trying to game the system for his own gain. This was a kid finding another way to get to a different school because the school didn't follow the rules.
Right,
So, if anything, it's empowering to the players to where this is an example of saying, well, if a school is going to do this, I do have another option that's great, but this isn't something that should be commonplace. The
right,
fact that it's only happened once so far is great, but it's frankly disgusting that this happened. I mean, look, Miami aside, we talked all about what happened with UNLV earlier this year and their quarterback situation, their NIL collective, and before
hmm,
knowing all the facts and stuff. The initial story, you always side with the players in these situations. You
of
don't really
course,
side with the collectives or with the larger schools because they've been making money hand over fist for a long, long time.
Yeah.
So for players, this should be a warning shot. And frankly, the thing that's really crazy about this, Chris, is that Wisconsin's always been a program that's semi recruited South Florida pretty well. The Big Ten collectively as a conference, don't look any further than Jeremiah Smith
Yeah.
over at Ohio State to see what the impact is of South Florida talent in the Big Ten. Um, this should spell problems for them in the future because if you do that to one player from American Heritage, which is a powerhouse here in South Florida,
Yeah.
coaches know each other, players know each other.
Oh,
When Xavier comes
absolutely.
back home, they're going to talk all about what the situation was.
Oh, absolutely.
You're not going to get another 3, 4, 5-star talent from South Florida for years because
Yeah.
of doing something like this.
So the big issue with UW is they're accusing of tampering. How much ground do you think UW stands on or the Big Ten stands on? Because there have been, I mean, it's very rare that you see because there's this, I feel like there's a sort of tact, there's a sort of class that is upheld with a lot of institutions in these conferences to not kind of get in the nitty gritty. I think we discussed it last time in the last episode, talking about most people understand the transfer portal NIL at this point until there is a governing authority is pretty much the wild, wild west. And so it's kind of like a gentleman's handshake, a gentleman's understanding that, hey, like people are going to do this. I mean, we saw it with Horton or not Horton. Was it Horton that went to Alabama?
Yeah, this
Yeah.
season, yes.
I mean, when you see a kid enter the transfer portal, he puts like a, do not contact, and you already are hearing there's a strong implication that he's going to go to a particular university. You can kind of just automatically assume there's a little tampering. But again, tamper with the label of tampering being used, it technically isn't illegal. So how much ground do you think UW and the Big Ten have after insinuating the tampering with Miami?
0, because the idea of this rule, like, get rid of the tampering phrase, but the way that the rule is supposed to be enforced is that coaches cannot have contact with these players during this period.
Right.
That's where the whole tampering piece comes in from. But again, most of these deals, and I'm sure what happened with Isaiah Horton is the same, doesn't have to go through a coach because when you're talking about coming from a place like South Florida and having all of this talent, you have relationships with those players from those programs.
Yep.
There are probably people on Miami's roster that Xavier Lucas has known since, no lie, the second and third grade when
Yeah.
they played together in youth football and Optimus football and middle school and high school and travel teams and 7-on-7s and all sorts of football related events, be it flag, non-contact, and tackle over the years. Isaiah Horton, I think, if I remember correctly, was originally at Alabama or an Alabama recruit too years ago
Mhm.
before he came to Miami. So I don't think there's an issue there in terms of coaches that we need to really insinuate. It's just more of, hey, players talk to each other. And they're saying, well, this is what's happening. So if you want to come, if you're interested in the time period opens and you can contact the coach or coaches contact you in that window when it happens. That's why some of these things happen quickly. The same thing with Carson Beck, where they're going to say, oh, well, Hannah Cavender was tampering. Like, no, they're dating each other. That doesn't mean they're legally, disallowed from talking to each other about those things. It's not like the same conflict of interest or insider trading that happens in the stock market. And it's the same
Right.
thing when it comes to tampering about an employment phrase. Because if you hear tampering, those of us in the professional world, tampering is all about poaching employees from other companies. That's a workplace term. So a lot of like the casual fans are saying, "Oh, well, Wisconsin's a right to work state just like Florida." Remember, they're not employees.
Yep.
So you can't even use right to work to your example. If you want to do that, be our guest. Now you really get to get to pay players to be a part of your program. So what do they have to stand on? Nothing. If anything, I think it puts the entire Big Ten more in danger when it comes to recruiting because if this template was being used at Wisconsin, you better believe it's being used at all the other member
Oh,
institutions of the Big Ten
absolutely.
Conference.
I mean, well, you
So
saw the one of the first people to get involved. It was almost, I think it was actually a coordinated effort between both schools at the same time, but both the Big Ten and UW both released statements saying basically they're really disappointed with how Xavier Lucas went about this. And actually, I don't even think they addressed Xavier Lucas at first. That was a couple days afterwards. It was they addressed the University of Miami, and it was basically a shot across the bow to University of Miami, like, hey, don't play with our players. Don't mess with it. Don't dip into our Kool-Aid, you know? And I know we've been discussing this from a player perspective in terms of the repercussions of what could happen. But what sort of, because they broke that NCAA bylaw of having to file the paperwork within 2 days, what sort of repercussions do you think the University of Wisconsin will now face from the NCAA? Because it's kind of funny they complained, but they actually may have incriminated themselves by not following the bylaw.
Incriminated themselves by not following the bylaw, and also incriminated themselves because in their statement they said that there was some sort of monetary transaction with Xavier Lucas. Well, if he wasn't being paid by the collective and he
Yep.
wasn't being paid yet by this, supposed, federal change is going to happen in terms of revenue sharing, are you trying to say that you produced money for a player that isn't legal, that isn't actually something that's part of college sports yet? Uh, Unfortunately, I'm going to sound like a broken record here when they said that what kind of stance does Wisconsin have in terms of blaming Miami? And I put zero. I think there's actually zero repercussions for Wisconsin in this case as well, because frankly, the
Wow.
NCAA has no room to stand on anymore. They've had their hands tied in terms of losing lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. I think the last thing they want to do is possibly lose another case or have to bury something else or carry something else through in court on their end. I think this is just more of just PR and saber rattling from the Big Ten in Wisconsin, just to make themselves, make their fans feel like they did something, knowing all well that there was nothing they can do with this situation.
Yeah, and we're hearing, just running along with the theme of tampering. Pete Nakos from On Three recently dropped a bombshell of an article today saying that Jeremiah Smith and Cordell Tate, the two star wide receivers from the university, from Ohio State University, have been offered 4.5 and $1 million to enter the transfer portal. It clearly is the wild, wild west at this point, with millions upon millions of dollars being thrown these kids' way. I mean, listen, if I would literally go play for Appalachian State right now at this point if you gave me $4.5 million a year. How do we, Rudy? I mean, we're going to go into a segment at the end of the show, which will continue on in the season. But let's get into it a little bit here. How do we fix the transfer portal? What would you do to kind of restrict or to kind of keep these kind of things from happening?
Well, here's the funny part, right? Because if you think of what Wisconsin and the Big Ten were doing, it's not a bad idea in theory if you want to try to get players to commit to a period of about 2 years in terms of not transferring in order to receive these types of benefits. What the Big Ten and Wisconsin did wrong, outside of jumping the gun for this decision to happen, is only doing it by themselves.
Yeah.
So for a conference to try to lock in players for a longer period of time than what the entire, rest of the country is doing, this is what led me to one of our first tinfoil hat theories of the night. My fruit basket is full, so I'm not going to go grab that
That's all right.
at the moment. But just imagine a tinfoil hat going over my head here for a second. This makes me think that this was a trial balloon for the SEC as well, because in the last couple of
Oh yeah.
years, there's nothing that one of those two conferences have done that the other hasn't followed suit with. So it makes me wonder if this was already happening in the Big Ten, better believe your bottom dollar that this also exists in the SEC right now, and it has been talked about because they're able to keep things a little bit more tight-lipped. So I think this was a good way to try to help fix that a little bit, because the one issue is really just the nature of how quickly from one year to the next a player is moving from a program for no reasons other than better profit, or playing time is understandable, but it's really a 1 year renewable free agency that college football has right now. If they
Yeah.
want to bring that down to bring that to 2 years, I'm not opposed to that. At the same time, if they want to do something to change the draft eligibility for players as well, because that's something you saw in basketball for a long time, was you couldn't go to the NBA after your freshman year of college. You had to commit for like 2 to 3 years unless you went straight out of high school like Kobe Bryant did.
Right.
So if they wanted to implement something like that, I think that makes sense. Where it's like you can't go to. I think right now you can't go to the NFL after your freshman year of college, but you shouldn't be able to then move year after year after year, just to preserve some sort of continuity. Because it's as exciting as it kind of is in this off season right now. It's not really sustainable, I think, for the quality of play that eventually makes it to the NFL. Because what you're seeing is we talked about it all season when it comes to replacing Lance Guidry and now bringing in Corey Heatherman. It simplifies your defenses because you always have this inconsistency with player personnel.
Yep.
Offense, it's a little easier for different personnel to play each other and to play with each other and gain chemistry. So you might actually elevate the level of college football in that regard, and then also maybe bring some more talent and football knowledge to your talent pool that then goes to the NFL. So the NFL doesn't have to simplify their offenses, even though it's doing wonders for Jaden Daniels right now and the Washington Commanders. So I think it's something like that. It just has to be enforced across the entire bit of Division One FBS college football playoff eligible conferences and programs. Or maybe that's the other deal. You have to do it where it's within, like, the Power Four has to come together and make these rules for the college football playoff plus independence. Like, I think this needs to be led by the playoff committee. And what we've talked about before, and what I think everyone has talked about, is getting a commissioner of college
Yeah,
football
and
that
that's
has some authority.
and I think this is college football is going to be just like real life economics. Um, when the powerful people are impacted, changes come, but while it only affects the peasants and the little ones, they're not going to care. But when you have like a UW and you'll see the Big Ten involved, I think if this was happening at like a Big 12 school or a Group of Five school, I don't think this would be gaining any attention. But the fact that it happened at the University of Wisconsin, involved a Big Ten school, I think we're going to see handles being put on college football. I think we're quickly realizing, with when you see coaches like Kirby Smart talking about the transfer portal, making sure there's only maybe one, things will start changing. And we kind of insinuated this at the very beginning of the season. We were talking about it's only a matter of time before there's a governing body over college football where college football walks away from the NCAA. I don't think it's a matter of if, I think it's just a matter of when. And I think cases like this, Xavier Lucas' story, I mean, if Jeremiah Smith, I mean, if Tate leaves, I don't think it'll be as big of a deal, but I think, and I don't think Jeremiah Smith is going to leave. It's a pipe dream, but if he does leave, it will call it now. There will be hell to pay in the Big Ten. People will be demanding some sort of a commissioner, some sort of rules, because again, once you rattle the big boys and the blue chippers, they're not going to stand to have that. The good old boys do not like that, but we'll have to wait and see. I think it's going to be a very interesting 2025 season. I think I insinuated this at the very beginning of the season. The next 3 to 5 years of college football will see the greatest change in the entire history of the sport and will forever change the sport moving forward. And I'm just kind of glad that we're getting to witness and getting to be a part of this. But let's get a little bit closer to home. Since we are officially in the offseason, I thought we would take a look back at the season and give our end of the year report for our Canes. We did this at the midway point, and I've put them up right here. Here are our grades from the midseason report from earlier this season. Why don't we kick things off with you, Rudy? Which side of the ball do you want to start on?
Let's start with the good side. So I'll take the offense on that one. So you want me to deliver the end of the year report card
Yeah,
now?
yeah,
See at
they
the
can they
beginning.
can see it. Yep, and I'll go back and forth. I can toggle between the
A
the
lot of this
midseason and
is
the
probably going to be the same, if not
yep.
maybe a little rosier, because we got a full picture of what that offense could do. The overall grade that I gave the offense for the entire 2024 season was an A, because you really can't blame anything that's happened to the Miami Hurricanes in that year on the offense. I gave
Yeah.
the offensive line an A solidly, because
Mhm.
guess what? They opened up some running holes for Damian Martinez and for Jordan Lyle and for Mark Fletcher. They protected Cam Ward pretty well consistently over the course of the year. Did they have some hiccups? Yeah. Did Cam hold on to the
Few.
ball a couple of times? Yeah, you can call some of those coverage sacks, but overall did really, really well. Running back, A as well. There were some games where the
Mhm.
running game had to, be more prominent than the passing game, and they did it. And sometimes the conditions of the game required Miami to pass first, pass often, and pass only. So you can't really hurt the running game on that end, because every second on the clock mattered for come from behind wins. The tight end position, I gave them an A as well, because Elijah Arroyo was fantastic. Riley Williams, who we didn't see a lot of and is, now left Miami, sadly, did a really good job. Elijah Lofton gives a lot of hope for that position in the future
Yeah.
from what we saw from him as a true freshman. The transfer portal pickups that Miami did get, including Luke Nichols' brother, and there's another tight end out of there. Both look really good, so really promising for next year, but a great job by them this past season. The wide receiver position, I gave an A minus. Why was I more critical of the wide receivers than every other position? Because if you're going to nitpick, and I think a couple of Miami's losses, specifically that one to Georgia Tech,
Yeah.
what you saw was an inability to gain separation against a secondary that was playing you very rough, that was,
Right.
holding on to you, that, frankly was interfering and holding. But you need to have your receiver core be able to break through that at some point. You have to get open more than once. If you can do that, Miami could have possibly won that game in the end. So that's why I gave them an A minus.
Yeah.
The
That's
ability to
fair.
create separation when needed, and also late in the year. Look, what's his name? Oh my God, I'm forgetting his name. Xavier Restrepo.
Mm.
Uh, there were a couple like really, really unsightly fumbles from him late in the season
Yeah.
that caused a
That poor
loss
guy.
at Syracuse and nearly caused a loss at home.
Hmm.
Um, they were uncharacteristic, but at the same time, like that's just part of it. It's one of those like, what have you done for me lately kind of thing. So as he
Of
is
course.
the greatest by statistics wide receiver in Miami Hurricane history, there were a couple of hiccups for the receiver core as in total at the end of the year. So quarterback position is the only thing that's left. That's an A plus. You're
Simple.
talking about a generational quarterback. Just that clip that came out today with Shador Sanders and Cam Ward talking to each other,
It's
and it's saying
hysterical.
like, yeah, like
I'm generational. He's like,
generational.
I'm legendary.
Larry, like
That's who.
legendary get their butt whooped.
It was so funny. That was a great thing. I want to real quick look at what I gave them an A. Okay, so I gave them an A. So just to kind of give you a background of how I scored this and graded the team, what I basically did was I compared obviously the first half of the season to the second half of the season, but this is the major caveat, especially when we get to the defensive side of the ball, with the idea of what was the overall goal of this team, right? And to me, I just want to state what I believe the goal of the team was. The first goal, obviously, is to win the ACC or get to the ACC championship game, right? Second goal is to win the ACC. Third goal is to get to the college football playoff. And finally, I truly believe this, and I said this at the beginning of the year, and I'm not going to walk away from it or stray from it. I thought we could have won a national championship. I thought we could have played for one. And if we had a decent defense, which we'll get into, we would have won. So those four criteria are the way I went through this. So I had originally given the offense an A at the midseason report. I gave them an A minus merely just because they did not achieve any of those goals. None of those goals were made. So to me, while they were statistically incredible and it was a once in a lifetime offense that I have not seen an offense. Maybe the 2001, 2002 team is close, but when I tell you, I just don't remember having a quarterback like Cam Ward ever, and I love Kenny D. Again, this is a generational squad. So I still give them an A minus despite the fact that they were incredible. O-line, I actually ticked them up. I gave them a B minus at the midseason. I ticked them up to an A because I thought they did a great job protecting Cam Ward. Cam Ward went through the season without getting an injury. He was not hurt. His jersey for the most part was very clean. Mistakes were minimal because of the O-line. So there was good run blocking. There was good pass protection. If there were any turnovers, it was because Cam Ward had made a gutsy move or we had, like we just said, an unusual fumble by Restrepo. So O-line, tick them up, gave them an A. As far as the rest of the team, status quo. I gave the running backs an A at the midseason. I'm giving them an A now. Studs, horses, tight ends, same thing. A plus at the midseason, A plus at the end. I thought the tight ends did their job when they were called to. Same thing with the wide receivers. I definitely see your point with Restrepo and bringing them down a little bit. I can understand that. But overall, again, I think they did their job. I think in the Georgia Tech game, you were 100% right. They could have played a little bit better. I also will add a caveat. In the second half of that Syracuse game, I think the wide receivers also could have played a little bit more of a factor, but I'm not going to penalize them on that because, again, statistically, they were incredible. And again, it was a very fun season to watch our offense. And then, of course, Cam Ward, you can't say enough about the guy. He will forever live in lore. He will always be, probably until the next quarterback wins a national championship, he will be the GOAT. And he is the GOAT for college football. He has the most amount of touchdowns out of any quarterback. So, I mean, the guy is goated. So I gave them a plus. Overall, A minus, just a slight tick down only because they did not achieve the goals that have been set out for the season. Let's move over, Rudy, to what we really need to talk about, that defense. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm glad you prefaced the rubric for what you're doing for all these different grades, because that's exactly what explains the defensive grades for the most part. I'm going to go by position first, and then I'm going to give the overall defensive grade. Um, yeah, you're right. Those were the 4 goals, and that's exactly what they should have been. There was no moving of the goalposts. You saw week after week, all of those things were attainable. And actually, it wasn't until the
Absolutely.
last game of the regular season that Miami didn't make the ACC championship game. It wasn't until the last game of the regular season, to possibly win the ACC and let Clemson in at the last minute to do that, and to also get in the college football playoff. I'm choking just like the defense did. So let's start with the defensive line. I gave them a C minus. I gave them a
Mm,
C minus primarily because I don't think they were the number one group at fault. I think when the defensive game plan is to get the ball out very, very quickly and throw it, it kind of neutralizes your pass rush. I'm actually choking really weird now.
don't go dying on me, Rudy. We need you.
There we go.
This is
It's
what
just a
happens when you.
matter.
This is what happens when we have to talk about our defense.
Yes, we get choked up, we get allergic, we get teary eyed, we get short of breath. It's not that they're taking our breath away in a good way. It took our breath
No.
away in the worst possible way. So yeah, I don't think it was primarily their fault. So it's hard to get a sack in under. Usually you're seeing like around 2.9 seconds on a pass rush for a blitz. Um, they're getting the ball out well before that. That's not because of a lack of pass rush. That's just we know other parts of the defense are suspect and flawed. So we're just gonna primary read will be wide open. We're going to give it to them and let them work their magic. So that's why
Yeah.
I gave them a C minus. There were penalties. There was sloppy play. There was some freelancing. Yes, all of that was there, but overall, they weren't the main problem.
Fair.
The linebacking core, I gave a D. I gave them a D because their primary responsibility was setting the edge. That was from really week 1 at Florida. Everyone wanted to blame Jaden Harris, who's now off to Georgia in the secondary, for not to, but a defensive back doesn't set the edge. That's a linebacker. That's always how that works, depending on how your gap scheme is setting up. If it's the Mark Anafrio 2 gap scheme or a traditional 4-2, 4-3, 1 gap, you have one guy set the edge. You have one guy playing in the hole. There were enough missed tackles that were going through. And some of this isn't really the fault of scheme. Some of this is also just, unfortunately, players coming back from injury. Because I think Kiko Marinoa, if he had started the season healthy, didn't have shoulder surgery in the offseason, there might have been less of a drop off from what we saw from him in 2023.
Right.
But definitely didn't do any favors. They were mismatched every time they had to go up against a running back or a tight end, which is both a speed issue and a tackling issue. So that combined with really the Achilles heel of the defense was a secondary. I gave them a D minus
Mm.
because there was a couple. I only gave them a D minus because there were 2 shining stars that we got out of that unit, and they're
OJ
both
Frederick.
freshmen or youngsters on the team. That's OJ Frederick at cornerback, and that's Zaquan
Mm.
Patterson, who's likely going to be a starting safety for you next year. You learn so much about your youngsters because you just didn't really have a good amount of cohesion in that unit. They got torched. They meaning the secondary, not Patterson and not Frederick,
Right.
but the secondary in general was torched 99% of the time when there was a blitz or there was a good read by like Mish Powell, for example, against like Wake Forest or Duke, were kind of shining moments in what was otherwise a regrettable season in terms of not being able to communicate, not understanding basic coverages, letting guys run wide open down the middle of the field. That was an absolute disaster. And because of
Absolutely.
that play, and the combined reasoning of knowing that you were a mildly competent defense away from competing for a conference championship, with Miami has only done once since joining the ACC, competing for a championship game. Miami's actually
Absolutely.
contended for the ACC twice. Have not won the ACC in the 20 years that it's been in the conference, making the college football playoff, which it had never done, and making a run in the college football playoff. Because as we noticed, this was the year for a team like Miami to do that because there was such a level playing field across college football. There was no dominant Alabama. As
Yep.
good as Ohio State looked through the run of the college football playoff, they looked flawed through parts of the year, particularly losing to Oregon,
Very.
having some, everyone at some point in time looked vulnerable. Notre Dame lost to Northern Illinois. There was all sorts of Penn State didn't really look like a good team until they made it to the playoff and they had to play a really well-ranked Notre Dame team to finally be exposed for what they were because their first 2 rounds were SMU and Boise State. So The way I look at that, this was the year for Miami to do it. And if
Absolutely.
you
I
were
agree.
able to just get one or two more stops, you do that. So that's why the overall grade for the defense was an F. It was one of the worst defenses in Miami Hurricane history, given the amount that was at stake and the qualifications of the offense.
Yeah, I again looking at the report card, it's almost identical grades we went by. The D line, I gave them originally an A plus because those first 6 games, first couple games, they looked studly. There was a lot of pressure. They looked dominant. They looked like they were manhandling a lot of offensive fronts. But we saw in the second half of the season there was a lack of domination. There was a lack of pressure. It felt like I definitely understand what you're saying when you talk about the quick release, teams becoming privy to that, using that to their advantage. Ohio State was a great example of that. While we didn't play them, they were one of those teams that was very privy to making the best of a weakened O line, you know. But the D line, they just again, I gave them an A plus, but I had to give them a C because at the end of the day, I just didn't see that domination on the line. Linebackers, I gave them originally an A minus at the midseason report. I gave them a D this time. Um, your D line is going to be your first line of defense, pun intended. But your linebackers, those are like basically your quarterbacks of the defense. And I felt there was a lot of leadership missing. I felt like there wasn't a presence. Kiko, for whatever reason, I didn't even know he had shoulder surgery. I had shoulder surgery back in September as well. And I kind of understand. I give him a little bit more grace now, understanding kind of like what he went through and having to play ball. I don't know how I would do that either, which explains, I think, a lot of the fizzle or the fire being taken out of him. So I can understand that, but still, linebackers didn't do their jobs. There wasn't there. I mean, I actually thinking about it now, there were very few fumbles in the second half of the season. I don't remember a lot of forced fumbles, which you usually get a lot out of your linebackers and your D line. So that's why their grades dropped. Obviously, the secondary, it was the weakest part of the team. That's why I gave them a D. They had a C minus in the midseason report, mainly because it was more, I was kind of padding their stats a little bit. I was giving them a little bit of a handicap with the C minus. I kind of always saw them as a D because they were the weakest unit. A lot of times you could just see the non-communication and what that caused, and just these explosive plays that just should have never happened. And again, that's why I gave the defense an F overall. They had a B plus at the beginning, but again, they were the reason we did not achieve any of our goals this year. And you're right. If we did have a half competent defense, we would have been there. And I know I'm just kind of reiterating what you're saying, but
Okay.
just to take it a little step further, I was chatting with some of our viewers in the comments, talking about next year and things like that. And I'm not expecting our defense to shut out. What I would like to see, and again, I don't mind giving up 35 points to an Ohio State if we played Ohio State. If next year we play Florida and we play Notre Dame, I'm not going to be upset if we give up 35 to either of those teams. But Bethune Cookman, USF, teams like that of that caliber, they should be donuts. They should be shutouts. There should be 7, maybe 10 points max. And that's when a defense, to me, is doing their job. It's okay to bend, but we saw our defense break several times. And it wasn't like it was every outing, it was at key moments in the game when you needed to stop. And you could see, because and the reason why I bring this point up is because you could see the inverse of it. When we needed to stop in a lot of our wins, the defense came through. They did their job. But in a lot of the 2 games we lost, and then especially in the Pop Tarts Bowl, you could see that there were times where, okay, if you were, again, like Rudy was alluding, a half competent defense, we would have stopped this and it would have been a loss. And I genuinely believe, and I joked about it in our group chat, our friends chat, we're going to be undefeated this season, but there shouldn't have been any reason why we weren't undefeated. We could have easily been an undefeated team. Like you said, Rudy, I love how you put it. This was the year. If not now, then when? Because I think this year had the most parity of any year in college football that I can remember in recent memory. And I've been watching college football for the last 25 years, 30 years, of my life. So, I mean, it was just, to me. And then overall, again, I just took the average of the offense and the defense, gave them a C. It was an A minus in the midseason because I thought that we looked good, but a C at the end of the year. You gave them a B.
I gave them a B only because this was a 10-win season. It's one of those things where you don't really see those that often. So
Yeah.
beggars can't be choosers in that sense. It was a fun year. It was really awful the way that it ended and knowing like what could have been.
Right.
But I am going to say the B is more of 10 wins is nice. And the B also is kind of just being bullish for next season to say, like, there is some promise here. There
Mhm.
is obviously new leadership at defense. There is more talent coming in. There's an entirely overhauled secondary that's coming in. Not to say that they're going to be a dominant defense, but it on paper at least should look better than next year. The scheme's obviously going to be different from next year. The incoming Carson Beck and seeing how that works out with his recovery from his UCL surgery to his elbow, and then also just some new pieces on offense, and possibly one more receiver in the transfer portal. We're not alluding to Jeremiah Smith, but somebody else receiver might be coming in through the portal in the spring period. You can't help but feel bad about that. So that's good momentum going into the next year. So I think on that end, like, look, Mario Cristobal and staff did what they could
Right.
in that respect. And the offensive staff did what they could, and gave us a lot of fun to watch. I think the only thing that I really want to add from last season, look, we've beaten a dead horse about that whole defensive perspective and the weaknesses on that team. I think you alluded to it really well. It was really in terms of timely stops, but the last game of the regular season against Syracuse, I think, really speaks volumes to the course
Yeah.
of the season of what we learned, because I don't know many fans who are happy being up 21-0 at the end of the first quarter. I think we all saw the exact
Yeah.
same thing of, okay, good, but we need more points. And the fact that Miami nearly immediately gave up the 21-point lead was what, that shows no Miami Hurricane team should ever be up by 3 scores. And look, it happens every now and then when you lose, but it becomes the historical precedence of Miami giving up double-digit multi-score leads to lose has always resulted in the overhauling of a staff. The number
Oh,
one time that
absolutely.
happened was it was 1984. Jimmy
Great
Johnson's
year.
first year as head coach. Yeah, great year for you, Chris. Great year for my parents because that was their last year being a child free.
Oh,
1984, Miami lost to Maryland at home in the Orange Bowl in what was one of the largest come from behind, upset wins in college football history at the time. And I think that margin still kind of holds up. Um, that was the catalyst for Jimmy Johnson overhauling the defensive staff and implementing his 4-3 defense. Before that, it was the remnants of Howard Schnellenberger, who was an offensive mastermind, but the defensive staff was still Howard's guys.
right.
After that game, Jimmy said, no, we're going to do defense my way. And if you guys don't like it, there's the door. I'll get my own guys in to do it. And Miami has run a version of that 4-3 defense pretty much every single year until Al Golden. And then now, going 4-2-5 standard because of all the spread offenses in college football. So that happened then. It happened in an overhaul of the defense after Mark D'Onofrio and Al Golden were shown the door by Miami. And now happened again after that year with Lance Guidry, because Lance came in already with a tough job, because remember this
That's
is
true.
multiple years now of Mario Cristobal. His first year was 2022. He had 2 co-defensive coordinators in Kevin Steele and I can't believe I'm
Was it
blanking on it.
Strong?
Yes, it's Charlie Strong. That's
Charlie Strong,
exactly
yeah.
who were the 2. They were co-defensive coordinators. Steele more of like a defensive analyst, like in booth defensive coordinator. Charlie Strong doubling as
On the
linebackers
field.
and co-defensive coordinator on the field. That was the worst Mario Cristobal roster by far. They didn't even have a winning season. It was pretty awful in terms of trying to turn over that roster. Brings in Lance Guidry, has some issues and injuries, has to kind of switch to a 3-man front because of the injuries to the defensive line. But you get Ruben Bain as a true freshman who's just an absolute prodigy and outshone every other defensive lineman in the ACC in his freshman year, including 2 NFL players now, in Jared Verse, who's an all-star, and there's another guy who's he plays for the Rams right now. It's Braden. I forget his last name, but he was number 55 for Florida State that year that they went undefeated in the regular season as well, 2023. He outshone both of them in terms of what he did that first year. The one thing that I did notice that didn't get better with Lance Guidry in year 2 is that even then, Miami had trouble playing with a lead. And the one thing that Miami always seemed to do, regardless of whether they were leading or they were trailing, is that the drive immediately after a Miami touchdown or score, they immediately gave up a touchdown.
Yeah.
So that was something that no defense should really do. It's like those in volleyball, we have like the cardinal sins of you never miss a serve after a timeout, you never miss
Yeah.
a serve as your first point of the game or your like set point match point. Um, there's a few others too, but like a cardinal sin of a defense is giving up a score after your offense just went out there and scored. The same thing of, giving up a score after or essentially
Or
like
blowing a lead.
or blowing a lead.
Blowing a lead. I mean, and
Yeah.
the other thing I want to reiterate is I'm not going to sit here and poo-poo on a 10-win season. I think that's great. Don't get me wrong. That's great. But I never, and this is just in my personal life as well, I never look at people for where they're at. I look at people for what the potential is. Where are you going? I don't want to see, it's like, I love you. It's like we have this saying in church, it's like Jesus loves you where you are, but he loves you more enough to not leave you there. He wants you to be better. And it's like, I take that perspective as well. It's like, I love my team and I love UM and I love the fact we got 10 wins. That is great. But this was once in a generational team that we had in terms of the offense. And there is a standard, and then people can poo-poo this and say whatever they want, but in Miami, there is a standard, and that is championships. And I am sorry we have been, and I will say we have been irrelevant for the last 20 years, more or less. But at the end of the day, we should, where based on our location, based on our talent pool, we should be contending for national championships. Now, I'm not saying every year we should have a national championship team, but when we have the talent, we should be contending for them. And that is why I went as hard as we did on these report cards, and why, even though it's a 10-win season, it's probably one of the best seasons since 2017 that we've had. Again, we left way too much out there. There was way too much that was left out there for us not to let this. And I think if you don't learn from the past, you will unequivocally make the same mistake again. And I don't want to see that going into next year. I don't think we will. I think that with Heatherman here, new blood, new life. We can turn things around. Again, as I alluded last week, there's precedent for us to have a quick turnaround, as Manny Diaz did it in 2017. Speaking of that year, where he came on staff with Mark Richt and turned that around, brought the turnover chain in. I'm not saying we need to bring that back, but I do think we can turn this around. Heatherman has a history of turning things around. I think the future is still bright. I think with NIL, the transfer portal, Mario being the recruiter that he is, I think the future is still bright and the best is still yet to come. But we have to call what this year was, and that was a failure. At the end of the day, this was a failure. And it's okay. We still love our Canes. We say it at the end of every episode. It's all about the U. We will always bleed orange and green. But just like a family member, you're going to call them out when they mess up. And that's what we do, because that's what it's family. It's still all love. We still love this team. We still support this team. But we also want to call a spade and what it is, you know?
Yep.
Well, as we've talked about all season, we know college football, it's a broken system. There's a facet that everyone can take issue from, whether it's scheduling to playoff berths. So we decided to start a series called How to Fix College Football. Each week, we're going to take a look at a different aspect of the game we think could be better. Today, I thought we would take a look at the archaic bowl system. Rudy, how would you describe the current state of the bowls right now?
They're an afterthought. Let's just put it that way. Because, I mean, if you're not in the college football playoff and you're not one of those traditional former BCS bowls, so we're talking about, if for those of you who don't remember the bowl championship series that came after the poll era, we're talking about
Mhm.
four major bowls. You're talking about the Orange Bowl here in Miami, the Fiesta Bowl, which every Miami fan has PTSD of, regardless of generation. That's out in Arizona and Tempe. Well, it was in Tempe. It was at Sun Devil Stadium. Now it's being played at University of Phoenix Stadium. Either way, the Rose Bowl out
Mhm.
in California, which is an iconic venue,
The
traditionally
granddaddy.
Big Ten, right? The granddaddy of them all, as Keith Jackson used to say. Well, Nelly. And then the last one being the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans. So those traditionally are the four largest bowl games, but now you really, in the playoff era, you can add the Chick-fil-A Bowl, committee in
Mhm.
Atlanta that
The Peach
just
Bowl. Yep.
recently hosted the national championship in Mercedes-Benz Stadium. And now, as they announced today, after the Orange Bowl committee hosts the national championship game next year, the
6.
2026 calendar year, but like the 2025 season 2026 championship game, the 2026 season 2027 championship game will be played in Las Vegas. So now you can add another, kind of major venue where the college football playoff is almost getting away from the traditional bowl
Bowls.
committees to go to their own, beautiful sites to host the national championship game. So I think as much as the non-playoff bowls are overlooked now, your traditional bowl committees for the major bowls are also going to be left out because Las Vegas is going to be doing that. If they ever hosted a national championship game for college football in Los Angeles, you better believe it's not going to be at the Rose Bowl.
Yeah.
They're going to do it at SoFi. So they might give the Rose Bowl committee some, throw them a bone and say, "Hey, help us organize this and get what together with committee and help and resources." But that venue is going to be removed from that premier college football environment. And again, we don't need to worry about having a dome in Los Angeles. Let's just say right now too, like with the exception of the disaster that has been this year, with natural disasters in terms of the fires in
Yeah.
Altadena and in Pacific Palisades, and continuously they're still going on. There was another fire that happened, I believe, earlier this week, in a different part of the hills in Sepulveda Pass. Outside of this anomaly, that's been one of the worst wildfires to hit the Los Angeles area in over a century. It's a beautiful place to play football in December and January. So
Well, it's the
why
first
not do
that's
it at the Rose Bowl?
yeah, and just to give people a little bit of a history, like what's a bowl? I don't understand what a bowl is. Where does this come from? So in the early 1900s, basically college football was a very regional sport. So you had teams out west and you had teams out east. And so the Rose Bowl, which is why they called the Granddaddy, was the first bowl to be ever played. And what that was an East Coast team coming over to play a West Coast team to see kind of who was the better program, right? And as this developed, then you had the Orange Bowl come around, the Sugar Bowl, and then the Fiesta Bowl, which are the four main bowls come around. And what they did was they just associated themselves with whatever region they were in. So you had obviously the southern regions with the Sugar Bowl and the Orange Bowl. You had obviously what we look at now as the Big 12 was originally called the WAC or the Western Athletic Conference, and
And the
you
Southwest
and
Conference
the
too.
Southwest Comp, which will eventually, yeah, the WAC eventually turns into the SWAC. All these things I know I'm getting a little inside college football, but to understand is there was a basically regionality, and what they wanted to do is they wanted to bring teams around to make it a more national sport. Then it was great because again, everyone was kind of independent. Now we've got a national system basically, which basically makes these bowls irrelevant. And in my opinion, there are far too many. We had 47 bowls this last year, which to me is you went from having four main ones and then every couple of years starting in like the 70s, you got to like maybe like 13, which is what was the incentive of getting to a bowl because you'd have your regular season, you'd have a poll through writers in the AP pick their national champion, and then as like a little like kind of dessert for the college football season, you would get a bowl, and teams would get one more shot to play and see how they stacked up against other schools. Eventually, we got into the AP area, and they started doing more, and then BCS, and now we have a 4 team, and now a 12 team. They're completely irrelevant. So, and we've not only seen the irrelevancy in terms of just a saturation of the market, but we've seen now opt-outs becoming a regular occurrence each and every year to the point to where you have the shell of a team, which we saw this year in several games, where you had basically second and third stringers playing each other, which no one really wants to see, right? And so to the point, like I said, where it, you'll have like an Alabama versus Michigan, but what you really have is you have scout teams playing each other. So to me, this is where I was like, how do we make these things more relevant? How do we bring back the prestige of the bowl without having to just completely eliminate them? Because if what you're saying is true, Rudy, and they still stick with the Las Vegas championship and things like that, and even possibility of moving to LA, having a championship, you're going to make them literally irrelevant. There will be no point of having a bowl anymore. Because again, when you looked even at the stadium, you can go look at screenshots. Half the stadiums were empty. So it's not like people are going to these things anymore like they used to. So My idea to fix the bowl system would be to move the bowls to the beginning of each season. You would use the bowls to build excitement and anticipation for the upcoming season. You can keep them conference aligned to create more competition. So the Orange Bowl would still be associated with the SEC. I mean, the ACC and the SEC and Big Ten. You would have, the Rose Bowl be your Big Ten, and I mean, if the Pac can resurrect itself, you bring them into it. But basically, I would structure the bowls to have each team be uh, basically have the bowls structured in a way that the teams would be playing it, that the teams that would be playing in it would be structured based on their standing in each conference. So, for example, the Orange Bowl has a tie with the ACC and the SEC and or the Big Ten, depending on where they want to go. The SEC championship has the act technically the allegiance to go to the Sugar Bowl, but they could play in an SEC team could play in the Orange Bowl as well. But what I would do is I would have the highest ranked ACC team play the highest or second highest ranked team in whatever opposing conference, and then we would go down the line. And then you would take each conference for whatever bowl. I think we need to get rid of the 47, but what you do is you would create this, okay, one verse one, one verse two, two verse one, whatever you want to be, two verse three. Essentially, what you would have is as you would go down, you would have the four verse, you would not be playing the number four team in the SEC playing the number 10 team in the ACC. And what you would do is you would not only build an excitement, you would base it on the former season also. That's the other thing. So each year, the bowl is based on your record of the season. So we would take this 2024 season and bring it into the 2025 season. So whatever your record was in 2024, it would place you in the bowl for 2025. You would play an equal standing team, and think about it. You would bring revenue to wherever these bowls are being held because people would be super excited. It would give people a last chance to go, travel with their family, go see a game. You could even, this was another stipulation I wanted to put on it. You could even make it an exhibition. A lot of teams, a lot of coaches, that's how they treat this. They treat it like an exhibition game. They'll maybe only start for their starters for half a game and then take them out. You can still play your starters the whole game, but you don't make it consequential in this season. Now, you can make it consequential when it relates to AP ranking, which we're going to talk about in another week of a ranking and how we can change rankings. But what you could do is you would have a better litmus test of seeing, okay, the number one ACC school versus the number one SEC school or number two SEC school. Okay, well, now we see where they're really at, right? And as you go down the bowls, because you'll have 20, 30 bowls, every team would be that's bowl eligible would have a bowl. They could play in a week 0, or you can make it week 1. We can eliminate these boring FCS games that happen at the beginning of every season, and you could really build this anticipation where the bowls not only will get, because think about it, when you get to the end of the season with the bowl, you get these half-packed stadiums. Why? Because there's not a lot of intrigue. Their teams aren't playing for championships. Their teams weren't ranked high. Guess what? At the beginning of the season, you have none of that. You have all the excitement. Everyone's going to want to go, and you're going to have that. Think about it. We're playing Notre Dame in our first game. Imagine if that was the Peach Bowl. Like, playing Notre Dame's awesome as it is, but now we're playing in the Peach Bowl at the beginning of the season. What do you think of my idea, Rudy?
I like it for a few reasons. And I really like it because part of the history lesson that you gave in terms of the Bulls and where they came about is 100% accurate, but there's a couple of extra details that I think is really great for what your argument is. And it's that the original Bowl committees, we talked about this where, like, for example, if they were to host a championship game in LA, they would let the Rose Bowl committee help them in terms of resources and stuff. When they started putting together these bowl games, the committees operated as like de facto tourism boards for these
Mm-hmm.
different towns. So if you look at the Orange Bowl committee, for example, in Miami, they predate the Greater Miami Convention and Visitors Bureau. Back then, the records didn't really matter as much in college football. Like, you still needed to have a winning season to go to a bowl, but
Yeah.
it was the reward at the end of the season for this, college program that plays in a landlocked state that is suffering in the winter time to come down to South Florida or to go to Southern California or to go to the desert or even the Cotton Bowl, for example, in Texas, to
Yep.
go down somewhere south and warm and have a vacation for everybody. So by moving the bowl games to the beginning of the year, you actually solve two problems. You're giving the Convention and Visitors Bureau, the bowl committee, an impetus to bring people in for travel because that's going to be around the Labor Day holiday or right before that. So kids are still off at summer vacation. In some cases, it might be a nice way to like send off their kid to college by going to their new future school's first game in terms of bringing them down for like one last hurrah vacation, the summer vacation, summer of, the endless summer essentially of
Yeah.
that mentality people love to talk about. Um, Also, you're helping out all of your different local community and businesses because when you move a bowl game into the winter months, into December and January, if you're playing in a really highly desirable bowl game in one of these areas like Florida, for example, or California, that's peak season for tourism. So they're not struggling for hotel occupancy. They're not
Yep.
struggling for inventory at all. As a matter of fact, it's the most expensive pricing of the year to go to these places. So if you're a college football fan, you're thinking you have to shell out top dollar to go to multiple games, playoff games in somebody else's backyard. Most likely, you're not likely going to be playing the first round at home if you're traveling for some of these. And then you have to do it again for a playoff game at one bowl, which is your quarterfinal, then again for a championship game. So you're shelling out peak season pricing multiple times. You're not going to get
Yep.
fans to go to every single one of those. So your later games essentially become a Super Bowl where the only people that can go to it are league officials, sponsors, and VIPs and
Yeah.
major donors. So unless you're T Boone Pickens, if he's still alive, who contributed to like half the Big 12, they're the only guys that can afford to do that. Or Phil Knight, who could buy half the stadium, just lay out in. So you're helping them out too by getting occupancy in what is usually an off season. The only thing you have to worry about is weather conditions because it's the middle of hurricane season. Yes, it's ungodly hot, but you know what? Move it to a night game. There won't be as many games
Yeah.
that you're competing with, so play it at night. It's still going to
Yeah.
be hot, yes, but coaches should love it because that's conditioning for their players to do, to play in that time of the night. And like you said before, if you want to make it a week zero and make it an effective college football preseason, that's great. You can use those results in other ways. And all the coaches know what they have, they know what to
Yeah.
work with. So I think it's kind of a win win in that regard. So all for it. I mean, for most teams, like, okay, do players lose out the chance of like finishing on one thing? Yeah, but that's what makes the regular season even more compelling in that way. And most
Yep.
players are opting out if they're not going to be continuing the next year anyway. So that's a great way to debut your young talent to say, you got a rookie, you got a transfer that first game to do it. Great. And also, one final piece on this. As you mentioned, a lot of the week one games already are basically bowl games because if you look at the Chick-fil-A college football kickoff game,
I
which
was
now,
just gonna bring that up.
yeah, between that one or like there's a couple that are also
There's a
done
Las
in Jerry
Vegas one
World.
too.
Right, there's one in Las Vegas, there's one in Jerry World, which isn't Chick-fil-A branded, but it's like, I forget what the company is behind that one that do it. There's a few
Yeah.
companies that do it now. Those are also done by the bowl committees. So the
Yeah.
Chick-fil-A kickoff game is a Peach Bowl committee sanctioned game. The one in Jerry World is a, Cotton Bowl sanctioned game in partnership with, Jerry Jones and the Cowboys, or the one in Las Vegas is a Las Vegas Bowl sanctioned game. So they're already doing it. Just bring it back to the preseason.
Yeah, and I think you really kind of you you create for the player himself. Like, this is a great introduction. Like, you're starting your season off, like, just think about how hype. I mean, would you rather play Samford week one or would you rather play Alabama? You know what I mean? Like, it to me, it writes itself. It's literally, I can't think of, especially if you approach it, like I said, as an exhibition game, you don't make it count. Because again, the bowl game doesn't count at the end of the season. Like, no one looks at the bowl game. No one's going to look at this year's bowl games and go, okay, well, we're going to use that to determine next year. No one ever does that. And it
Yep.
plays zero factor. So if you just move it to the beginning of the season, you now are creating a relevance because you're now bringing teams that, again, that's why I made the stipulation also. It goes on the conference standings from the year prior. So let's say, like Ohio State, well, again, we're going to take playoffs out, but Ohio State, I think, finished second in the Big Ten, right? So you have Oregon. So the Oregon would play, let's just say, I don't know, they're going to be in the Rose Bowl, right? Because they're in the Big Ten. Oregon would maybe play, and they would used to play a Pac-12. Let's give them a Big 12 team. They would play the number one team in the Big 12, which I believe was Arizona State. So you have Oregon versus Arizona State in the Rose Bowl. Like week zero, week one. Who doesn't want to see that? You know what I mean? As opposed to Oregon playing like Eastern Washington. You know what I mean? Like no one wants to watch, sorry, Eastern Washington fans, but no one wants to watch that. You know what I mean? And then again, like you said, I think it's a great way. Also, if you look at it too, like maybe some of these families aren't able to travel, but there's a bowl game that's within driving distance, right? And so they maybe may not be able to get to one of their kids' games or their first game, but they can get to that bowl game because it's, hey, my son's going to play at, let's just use the University of Wisconsin. Okay, well, Miami and Wisconsin are playing each other in the Orange Bowl. Well, guess what? My son, Xavier Lucas, who's going to Wisconsin, I can't go watch him play there, but he's playing in the Orange Bowl in week 0. I can go watch that game. Super easy for families. You know what I mean? I think also you alluded to the second thing. Um, I grew up in the hospitality industry, worked in the hospitality industry. The number one week of the year, the most expensive week of the year is New Year's Eve. Between Christmas, the day after Christmas to New Year's Eve is the most expensive. Any hotel you go to, Motel 6, Holiday Inn, the most expensive time is going to be that week. You remove that. You get them in right before Labor Day. You get them in right as they goes in. Easy for people to take time off because it is Labor Day. Bam, it's done. I can't see any cons with it.
Here's another thing that's also zero con into that. The bowl committees get to fully brand their game again.
Oh yeah.
They can still help with the college football playoff. They can still use their venues for the college football playoff when the end of the regular season happens. But the Sugar Bowl can back to being the Sugar Bowl again. The Orange Bowl can be the Orange Bowl again. The Rose Bowl can be the Rose Bowl again. If you watch those games, yeah, there was some signage like the Rose Bowl had, the iconic logo on the 50, but outside of that 50-yard line, every other piece of branding said college football playoff, quarterfinal or college football game semifinal at the Rose Bowl. The
Yeah.
Rose Bowl was buried underneath that. You're
And
going to
what's,
see
what's
it.
what's what's weird to me too is, and this is what I was when we were going into this, and this was my trepidation with keeping the Bulls in the college football playoff was I'm like, wait a minute. So if you go through the CFP and win, you'll be the Cotton Bowl champion, the Sugar Bowl champion, the
Yep,
Rose Bowl champion, and the
you're
national
collecting the
championship. It's
rings
like
like Thanos.
you're Thanos. Exactly. I'm like, get away with that because you're diluting. You're immediately diluting the value, and you're right. Like, and I think again, we're going to talk about this how we would fix the playoffs, but here's a little sneak peek. Just make the playoffs like the NFL, like up until the championship game, higher ranked team gets that home field advantage. Think of the revenue you're going to bring in to these college towns. You know what I mean? Like, trust me, I think Tuscaloosa, trust me, in December, they're not seeing any money. You know what I mean? I guarantee you those hundreds of millions of dollars they would be getting to have their Crimson Tide hosting, 2 or 3 playoff games if they're ranked high enough. They'll love that. And I don't think anyone's going to have an issue with that in Tuscaloosa or in Ann Arbor or in Columbus. We in Miami, we're spoiled. It's like we have 1,000 other things to do, but there's a lot of college towns where there's nothing to do. Those towns literally, for a lack of better terms, die as soon as economically, as soon as the college football season is over. And they're just waiting till, August comes around the following year. So I think this, like I said, it's a win-win. To me, it's simple. Make this happen. I'm not going to charge anyone for this. All I want is a lifetime supply to go to any of these bowl games once they make this happen. And so let's just make it happen for the love of God.
Don't charge anyone a flat fee, but a small 2% royalty won't, would help a
Or,
lot.
or, or at least, just give us a set at each of these bowl games that we can host this show from. I would love that as well. Listen, I'm not gonna, and an
A
all expense
podcast
paid trip
route.
as well. Yeah, exactly. A little pod. We don't need just a little corner, just a little corner, a little something. Anything, Rudy, we want to talk about before we sign off?
Uh, um, I guess the only thing I kind of want to touch back on again is when we talked about the 2-year agreements in the Big Ten. You were talking about like the numbers that are being thrown out with Jeremiah Smith to possibly leave. If he actually does leave, let's take
Hmm.
Miami out of the equation. Let's say if he just leaves to go anywhere, you better believe it's because of that 2-year stipulation that's going to be on NIL. That they're trying to say that
Uh,
the school owns your NIL for 2 years. Like I'm sorry, that's outside of the spirit of what NIL is supposed to be. So if that's what it is, the entire Big Ten is going to be put on notice to say that you're not going to retain any of your talent that you have because you're trying to force them into this agreement. So I think a decision to leave is not going to be so much shame on the player or shame on a team that takes them. I think the egg is completely on the face of the Big Ten for trying to force players into something that's against their interests. And the fans can be as unhappy as they want about that, but they have nobody but their conference representation to blame. And frankly, it's kind of nice to see another conference do something stupid for once, because as members of the ACC, we've been seeing it for 20 plus years. It's good to see someone else do it for once.
Yeah, and we will see. Maybe we'll add this to a how to fix college football segment. Well, Rudy, we have another one in the books. Thank you all for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Let us know, did we get our end of the year season report right? What do you think about the bowls? Did I hit the nail on the head? Did I miss? Is there something I missed? Do you think we could do something better with the bowls? Until next week, be good, y'all. Win the weekend, and as always, go Canes.
Are we a bunch of kooks? Maybe, but we have a podcast. Fight us.
Exactly. Be good, y'all.